The ridicule, the air raid sirens had fallen silent. But the screams had not. Sister Margaret Hartley moved through the emergency ward of St. Bartholomew's Hospital with practiced efficiency, her white uniform already stained crimson from the night's carnage. London, October 1940, and the Blitz showed no mercy. Another one bleeding out in Bay 3. A young nurse called, panic threading through her voice. Margaret rushed over, her trained eyes immediately assessing the soldier's pallor, the way his lips had turned blue. Exsanguination. He needed blood, and he needed it now. But the blood bank was nearly depleted, as it had been every night this week. The German bombs didn't discriminate, and neither did the desperate need for transfusions. "Get me a donor," Margaret shouted. But she already knew the answer. They tested everyone on staff twice already tonight. No matches. The soldier died at 3:47 a.m. He was the fourth that night alone, all for want of blood as dawn broke over the devastated city. Margaret sat in the staff room, exhausted but unable to rest. In her hands, she held a medical journal from America, its pages dog-eared from repeated reading. Dr. Charles Drew's work on blood plasma preservation stared back at her. The article discussed refrigeration, anticoagulants, and the possibility of storing blood for longer periods. But Margaret's mind had wandered further. What if they didn't need to store whole blood at all? What if plasma alone could buy precious time? What if there was a simpler method, one that didn't require the elaborate refrigeration systems that were impossible to maintain during the bombings? She began to sketch notes in her journal, her hand moving faster than her thoughts could organize. A preservation solution using readily available materials, sodium citrate glucose, a specific temperature range that could be maintained even in field conditions. If she could stabilize the plasma long enough to transport it to field hospitals. "Sister Hartley, you look dreadful. Go home and sleep." Margaret looked up to find Dr. Edmund Thornberry standing in the doorway, his surgical cap still on, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. At 53, he was a senior surgeon at St. Bart's and had been practicing medicine since before Margaret was born. "Dr. Thornberry, I've been thinking, always dangerous," he said with a tired smile, "about blood preservation. I've been reading about the American research, and I think there might be a way to create a simplified field method, something that could be transported to the front lines, something that wouldn't require constant refrigeration." "Sister Hartley," Dr. Thornberry interrupted, his smile fading. "You're an excellent nurse, one of the best I've worked with. But blood preservation is a matter for research laboratories and medical doctors, not for nurses with ideas above their station." Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. "But, sir, if we could just experiment with—" "Experiment?" Dr. Thornberry's voice rose. "We're not mad scientists, sister. We follow established medical protocols. The blood banking system we have, limited as it is, has been developed by the finest medical minds in Britain. What you're suggesting is not only impractical, but potentially dangerous. People are dying because we don't have enough blood. People are dying because there's a war on." Dr. Thornberry snapped. "And they'll die faster if we start using improving methods cooked up by overworked nurses suffering from exhaustion. Go home, Sister Hartley. That's an order." Margaret stood, gathering her journal protectively to her chest. As she turned to leave, she heard Dr. Thornberry speaking to another physician who'd just entered. "Poor girl's been working too hard. Now she thinks she's going to revolutionize blood transfusion medicine. Next, she'll be wanting to perform surgery." Their laughter followed her down the corridor. Margaret's hands trembled, but not from exhaustion or humiliation. They trembled with determination. She thought of the soldier in Bay 3, of the dozen others who died that month alone, of the hundreds dying in field hospitals across Europe for want of this one thing she might be able to provide. That morning, in her small flat in Bloomsbury, Margaret didn't sleep. Instead, she began a plan. If the hospital wouldn't let her experiment, she'd find another way. She had 2 days off coming to her. 2 days to prove that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas came not from laboratories, but from the bedside of a dying. The secret experiment. Margaret's flat had been transformed into a makeshift laboratory. On her kitchen table, carefully arranged, were bottles of sodium citrate she'd purchased from a chemist 3 streets over, glucose solution, glass containers sterilized in her oven, and her most precious acquisition, 2 pints of blood. She'd donated one herself that morning, though it had left her lightheaded. The other had come from Thomas Pemberton, her building's ARP warden, who'd been more than willing to help after she'd patched up his son's broken arm last month. She'd told him it was for research, which was technically true, even if she'd been vague about the official nature of that research. The afternoon sun streamed through the window she'd carefully blacked out at night. Margaret had only these few hours of daylight to work with, and she intended to use every minute. Her notes lay open beside her, filled with calculations and observations from weeks of reading every medical journal she could get her hands on. The principle was sound. Separate the plasma from the red blood cells, treat it with the right combination of preservatives, maintain it at the right temperature, and it could remain viable for transfusion far longer than whole blood. But the devil, as always, was in the details. She began with the separation, carefully spinning the blood in containers using a hand-cranked device she borrowed from the hospital laboratory, borrowed being a generous term for what was essentially theft, though she planned to return it. The centrifugal force slowly divided the blood into its components, the heavy red cells sinking to the bottom, the golden plasma rising to the top. "Beautiful," Margaret whispered, watching the transformation. She extracted the plasma with a precision learned from years of nursing, then added her preservation solution, a carefully calculated mixture of sodium citrate and glucose in distilled water. The ratio was critical. Too much citrate and it would be toxic. Too little and the plasma would clot. The glucose would provide energy for any remaining cellular components and help maintain osmotic balance. Now came the real test, temperature stability. Margaret had observed that the American methods relied heavily on refrigeration that was unreliable in bombed-out hospitals and impossible in field conditions. But what if the preservation solution itself could buy enough time at slightly higher temperatures? What if it could remain viable for 24, even 48 hours, at room temperature? She prepared several samples, each with slightly different preservation ratios, and placed them at various locations around her flat. Some near the window where it was warmer, some in the coolest corner of her pantry, one in her icebox as control. Over the next 2 days, Margaret barely slept. Every 4 hours, she tested the samples for signs of degradation, examining them under her nursing microscope for bacterial growth, checking the color, the viscosity, testing pH levels with litmus paper. She filled notebook after notebook with observations. Sample 3, with a higher glucose concentration, showed the most promise. By hour 36, while the control sample in the icebox remained perfect, sample 3 maintained viability at room temperature. Incredible. But Margaret knew observations weren't enough. She needed to test it. On the 3rd morning, she pricked her finger and mixed a drop of her blood with preserved plasma from sample 3 under the microscope. She held her breath, watching for the telltale signs of agglutination, clumping that would indicate the plasma had degraded, that it would trigger a fatal transfusion reaction in a patient. Nothing. The cells remained separate, suspended, viable. "It works," she breathed, hardly daring to believe it. It actually works. But Margaret's elation was short-lived. She now faced an impossible dilemma. She had proved her method could work in theory, but she had no way to test it properly, no authority to implement it, and no one in the medical establishment who would take her seriously. That evening, as she sat at her kitchen table surrounded by her makeshift laboratory, there was a knock at her door. Margaret quickly began hiding the equipment, her heart racing. If anyone discovered what she'd been doing, unauthorized medical experimentation, theft of hospital equipment, she could lose her nursing license. "Sister Hartley?" "It's Thomas Pemberton." Margaret opened the door a crack. The ARP warden stood there, his face grim. "What's wrong?" "It's my boy, Jimmy. He had an accident at the factory. They've taken him to St. Bart's, but..." Thomas's voice cracked. "They're saying he needs blood urgently, and they don't have his type. They're saying there's nothing they can do." Margaret's mind raced. Jimmy Pemberton was 14 years old, the same age as the brother she lost in pneumonia 10 years ago. She thought of her preserved plasma, sitting in her kitchen, untested in humans but promising. "What's his blood type?" she asked quietly. "O positive," they said. Margaret was O negative, the universal donor. Her plasma would be compatible. She had a choice. Follow the rules, stay safe, let Jimmy Pemberton die like so many others, or break every regulation she'd ever sworn to uphold and possibly save a boy's life. "Get me to the hospital," Margaret said, already grabbing her coat and the carefully preserved plasma. Now, the midnight gamble. St. Bartholomew's Hospital at night was a different beast than during the day. The shadows seemed deeper, the hallways more labyrinthine. Margaret moved through them with purpose, Thomas Pemberton close behind her, the precious vial of preserved plasma hidden in her nursing bag. She found Jimmy in the emergency ward, his face ashen, his breathing shallow. Dr. Thornberry wasn't on duty, small mercies, but Dr. Alice Chin was a young physician who joined the staff only 3 months ago. "Sister Hartley, you're not on shift tonight," Dr. Chin said, looking up from Jimmy's chart. Her expression was grave. "I know. I'm here about the boy. Thomas Pemberton is my neighbor." Dr. Chin glanced at the father, then back to Margaret. "I'm sorry. We've tested everyone available. No positive. We called other hospitals, but with the bombings..." She didn't need to finish. Blood was scarce everywhere. "How long does he have?" Margaret asked quietly. "An hour. Perhaps 2 if we're lucky. The internal bleeding isn't severe, but he's lost too much already." Dr. Chen's voice was clinical, but Margaret could hear the frustration beneath it. How many had they lost this week alone? What if there was another option? Margaret said carefully. Dr. Chen raised an eyebrow. "What are you suggesting?" This was it. The moment where Margaret either retreated back into safety or crossed a line that might end her career or save a life. "I've been researching blood plasma preservation," Margaret began. "I know it sounds unorthodox, but I've developed a method that could work. I have preserved plasma, my own, that's compatible with his blood type." "Preserved how?" "We don't have plasma preservation capability here," Dr. Chen said, her eyes narrowing with interest rather than dismissal. "Not officially, no. But I've been experimenting with a simplified preservation solution. Sodium citrate glucose, specific ratios. I've tested it for viability over 36 hours at room temperature." "You've been experimenting? Unofficially?" Dr. Chen's voice dropped to a whisper. "Sister Hartley, do you understand what you're suggesting? Unauthorized medical research, unapproved treatment methods." "I understand that boy is going to die in an hour if we do nothing," Margaret interrupted. "And I understand that what I'm proposing might save him." Dr. Chen looked at Jimmy, then at his father, whose face was a mask of desperate hope. She was young enough to remember what it felt like to want to break rules for the right reasons, but old enough to know the consequences. "Show me your research," Dr. Chen said finally. Margaret pulled out her notebooks, her test results, her careful documentation of every step. Dr. Chen read through it with practiced speed, her expression unreadable. "The methodology is sound," she admitted. "The preservation ratios are reasonable. But Sister Hartley, this hasn't been clinically tested. We have no idea if it will actually work in a human subject. It could trigger a massive transfusion reaction. It could kill him faster than the bleeding. Or it could save him," Margaret said. "Dr. Chen, I wouldn't suggest this if I had any doubts. I've been meticulous. The plasma is viable. I've tested it against my own blood under microscope. No agglutination, no degradation. Alice..." Thomas Pemberton spoke for the first time, his voice raw. "Please, if there's any chance." Dr. Chen was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "If we do this and something goes wrong, we'll both lose our licenses. You understand that?" "I understand," Margaret said. "And if we do this and it works, we're still going to have hell to pay for unauthorized treatment." "I understand that, too." Dr. Chen looked at Jimmy again, at the pallor of his skin, the blue tinge to his lips. She was a doctor. She'd taken an oath to do no harm, but also to preserve life. Sometimes those imperatives conflicted. "Prep the transfusion," Dr. Chen said quietly. "We'll start with a small test dose. If he shows any signs of reaction, We stop immediately. The next 20 minutes were the longest of Margaret's life. She prepared the plasma with shaking hands, setting up the transfusion apparatus while Dr. Chen monitored Jimmy's vital signs. Thomas Pemberton stood in the corner, his knuckles white as he gripped the back of a chair. Starting infusion, Dr. Chen announced, inserting the needle into Jimmy's arm. They waited. Every second felt like an eternity. Margaret watched Jimmy's face for any signs of distress. Flushing, difficulty breathing, the telltale signs of transfusion reaction. Nothing. Vital signs are stable, Dr. Chen murmured, her fingers on Jimmy's pulse. No immediate reaction. They increased the flow rate gradually, Margaret adjusting the drip with practiced precision. More waiting, more watching. Jimmy's color seemed to improve, or was that wishful thinking? His blood pressure is rising, Dr. Chen said, and now there was unmistakable excitement in her voice. His pulse is strengthening. Is it working? Thomas whispered. It's yes. Yes, I think it is, Dr. Chen said, checking Jimmy's pupils, his capillary refill. His perfusion is improving. The plasma is working. Margaret felt her knees go weak with relief. She'd been so certain, but certainty and confirmation were two different things. Jimmy Pemberton would live, but their relief was short-lived. The door to the ward burst open, and Dr. Edmund Thornberry stood there, still in his coat, clearly called in despite the late hour. His face was thunderous. What in God's name is going on here? Sister Chun, I received word that you were administering an unauthorized blood product to a patient. The room fell silent. Dr. Chen straightened, meeting Thornberry's gaze. Sir, the patient was dying. We had no compatible blood. Sister Hartley had. Sister Hartley. Thornberry turned his fury on Margaret. The nurse who fancies herself a medical researcher? I've heard about your little experiments. Hartley, breaking into hospital laboratories, stealing equipment, conducting unauthorized research. He strode to Jimmy's bedside, examining the transfusion setup with barely contained rage. And now you've convinced Dr. Chun to administer God knows what into this boy. It's preserved plasma, Margaret said, her voice steady despite her fear. It's working. Look at him. Working? You have no idea what you've done. The long-term effects, the contamination risks. He was dying, Margaret interrupted. And now he's not. Thornberry looked at Jimmy, and Margaret saw the moment when his medical training overrode his anger. The boy's color was better. His breathing was easier. Whatever Thornberry thought of Margaret's methods, he couldn't deny the evidence before him. This isn't over, Thornberry said coldly. Dr. Chun, Sister Hartley, you will both report to my office tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock sharp. We will discuss the consequences of your actions. As Thornberry left, Margaret and Dr. Chen exchanged glances. They'd saved a life, but at what cost? The trial. The administrative office at St. Bartholomew's Hospital had never felt so small. Margaret sat in a hard-backed chair, still in her uniform from the night before, exhaustion pulling at her bones. Beside her, Dr. Alice Chen sat with rigid posture, her face carefully neutral. Across the desk, Dr. Edmund Thornberry presided over what felt less like a meeting and more like a court-martial. To his right sat Dr. Harold Bancroft, the hospital's chief administrator, and to his left, Sister Catherine Moore, the matron of nurses. Let me be certain I understand the situation correctly, Dr. Bancroft began, his voice deceptively mild. Sister Hartley, you conducted unauthorized medical research in your home. You then stole hospital equipment to facilitate this research. Following this, you convinced Dr. Chun to administer an untested, unapproved blood product to a patient, Jimmy Pemberton, without following any proper channels or protocols. Is this accurate? Margaret's throat was dry, but she kept her voice steady. That's the outline, yes, sir. Though I prefer to say I borrowed the equipment, and I intend to return it. Borrowed, Thornberry scoffed. That's rich. And the blood product, Dr. Bancroft continued. This preserved plasma. Walk me through it again. Margaret did, explaining her methodology, her research, her careful testing. As she spoke, she pulled out her notebooks, laying them on the desk. Dr. Bancroft leafed through them, his expression unreadable. "The work is meticulous," he admitted. "I'll grant you that. But Sister Hartley, meticulous or not, you had no authority to conduct this research, let alone to apply it to a human patient." "The patient was dying," Margaret said. "I had a solution that could save him. Was I supposed to let him die to preserve proper channels?" "Yes," Thornberry said bluntly. "That's exactly what you should have done. Medical research exists for a reason, Sister Hartley. Testing protocols exist for a reason. We don't allow just anyone with a bright idea to experiment on dying patients, because the alternative is chaos and death." "But Jimmy Pemberton isn't dead," Dr. Chin interjected quietly. "He's awake this morning, asking for breakfast. His recovery is progressing better than we could have hoped." "One successful case doesn't validate the method," Thornberry countered. "It could have been luck. It could have been that he would have survived anyway. We don't know because proper controls weren't established." "With respect, sir," Margaret said, feeling her temper rise, "we absolutely know he would have died. He'd lost too much blood. We had no compatible donors. And he had perhaps an hour left. There was no might have survived anyway. He would have died." Sister Catherine Moore spoke for the first time, her voice measured. "Dr. Bancroft, Dr. Thornberry, I understand your concerns about protocol and authority, but we cannot ignore the practical realities we face every day. We lose patients regularly because we lack sufficient blood supplies. If Sister Hartley has indeed developed a method to preserve plasma effectively, particularly one that doesn't require constant refrigeration, the implications for field medicine could be enormous. The implications for medical ethics violations are also enormous." Thornberry shot back. "I propose a compromise," Dr. Bancroft said, raising a hand to forestall further argument. "Sister Hartley, your actions were inappropriate and violated hospital policy. Under normal circumstances, I would have no choice but to terminate your employment and recommend the revocation of your nursing license." Margaret's heart sank. This was it. Then, the end of her career. However, Dr. Bancroft continued, "These are not normal circumstances. We are at war. We lose patients every day for want of blood. If your method has merit, we cannot afford to ignore it out of adherence to peacetime protocols." He paused, considering. "Here is my proposal. Sister Hartley, you will work with Dr. Thornberry and a research team to properly document and test your preservation method. You will follow all proper protocols. You will keep meticulous records, and you will submit to oversight at every stage. If, and only if, the method proves viable under controlled conditions, we will consider implementing it more broadly." "But, sir," Thornberry began. "Dr. Thornberry, I understand your reservations. You will oversee this research personally. If at any point you determine the method is unsafe or ineffective, we will terminate the project immediately. But we must at least investigate properly." Thornberry's jaw worked, but he nodded curtly. "Very well. But I want it on record that I believe this sets a dangerous precedent." "Noted," Dr. Bancroft said. He turned to Margaret. "Sister Hartley, you will be placed on probation for 6 months. Any further violations of protocol, and you will be dismissed without further consideration. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," Margaret said, hardly daring believe she was being given this chance. "Dr. Chun," Dr. Bancroft continued, "you exercised poor judgment in agreeing to Sister Hartley's proposal without proper authorization. However, I recognize you were placed in an impossible situation. Consider this a formal reprimand. Don't let it happen again." "Yes, sir," Dr. Chin said. As they left the office, Margaret and Dr. Chin walked in silence until they were well away from administrative offices. "Well," Dr. Chin said finally, "that could have gone worse." "Could it?" Margaret asked, the reality of her situation sinking in. "I'm on probation, working under Thornberry's direct oversight. He despises me and my methods." "He despises change," Dr. Chin corrected. "But he's also a good doctor. If your method works, Margaret, really works, he'll come around. He'll have to." The research began that afternoon. Dr. Thornberry had commandeered a small laboratory space and assembled a team. Himself, Dr. Chun, a young biochemist named David Winters, and, reluctantly, Margaret. The atmosphere was frigid. "We will do this properly," Thornberry announced. "Sister Hartley, you will replicate your preservation method step by step with detailed documentation at each stage. Dr. Winters will verify the biochemistry. Dr. Chun and I will design proper testing protocols." Margaret demonstrated her method, explaining each step, each measurement, each decision. Dr. Winters took copious notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. To Margaret's surprise, his questions were sharp but fair, genuinely seeking to understand rather than to discredit. "The glucose concentration is interesting," Dr. Winters mused, examining a sample under microscope. "It's higher than I would have expected, but I can see the logic. It maintains cellular energy balance while the citrate prevents coagulation." "Exactly," Margaret said, warming to the discussion despite Thornberry's glowering presence. Over the next 2 weeks, they worked long hours, testing and retesting. They prepared dozens of plasma samples, subjected them to various temperature conditions, tested them for bacterial contamination, for pH stability, for cellular viability. Margaret's method held up under scrutiny. "I'll be damned," Dr. Winters said one evening, looking at a week's worth of test results. "It actually works. The plasma remains viable for 48 hours at room temperature, 72 with minimal refrigeration. Sister Hartley, this is remarkable." Even Thornberry couldn't argue with the data. "The in vitro results are promising," he admitted grudgingly. "But we need controlled clinical trials before we can consider broader implementation." "With respect, sir," Margaret said carefully, "every day we delay, people die. And if we rush ahead with inadequate testing, more people might die from transfusion reactions or contaminated plasma." Thornberry countered. "Medicine is not about good intentions, Sister Hartley. It's about rigorous science." But fate, it seemed, had other plans. That night, the air raid sirens began their mournful wail once again. The Blitz had returned with a vengeance, and with it, a flood of casualties that would test everything Margaret had worked for. The Blitz returns. The bomb hit 3 streets away from St. Bartholomew's, close enough that the building shook, close enough that Margaret felt percussion in her chest. The windows in the laboratory rattled ominously, but held. Through the blackout curtains, the sky glowed orange. "Here we go again," Dr. Winters muttered, already moving to secure the plasma samples they'd been working on. The casualties began arriving within minutes. Margaret abandoned the laboratory, pulling on her nursing apron as she rushed toward the emergency ward. The scene was chaos, organized chaos, but chaos nonetheless. Stretchers everywhere, blood on the floors, the smell of smoke and burned flesh thick in the air. "Sister Hartley, Bay 7 now." Sister Catherine Moore's voice cut through the din. Bay 7 held a young woman, perhaps 20, her leg mangled by shrapnel. Margaret assessed her quickly. Pallor, rapid pulse, blood pressure dropping. Severe hemorrhage. "She needs blood," Margaret called out. "Get in line." Another nurse responded grimly. "We got 12 critical cases, and our blood supply is already depleted." Margaret found Dr. Chun at the nurse's station, coordinating the chaos with remarkable efficiency despite the circumstances. "Alice, how much blood do we have?" 6 units. "Maybe 7. We got 20 patients who need transfusions urgently." The mathematics of triage were brutal and unforgiving. 6 units for 20 patients. 12 would die, maybe more. "The preserved plasma," Margaret said. "We have samples in the laboratory." "Margaret, they haven't been clinically tested. Jimmy Pemberton was one case." "And he lived," Margaret interrupted. "Alice, look around. We don't have the luxury of waiting for clinical trials. Those samples could save lives tonight." Dr. Chen's face was torn between medical ethics and practical reality. Before she could respond, Dr. Thornberry appeared, his surgical gown already bloodstained. "Dr. Chun, I need blood for a soldier in operating theater 2. He won't survive the hour without it." "Sir, we've already allocated the last of our reserves." "Then unallocate it. He's bleeding out on my table." "With respect, sir," Margaret interjected, knowing she was risking everything. We had preserved plasma in the laboratory, enough for a dozen transfusions at least. Thornberry rounded on her. Absolutely not. We are not using experimental blood products during a mass casualty event. Then what do you suggest? Margaret demanded, her professional composure finally cracking. Let them die? Pick and choose who deserves the blood we have and condemn the rest? Dr. Thornberry, you've seen our test results. The plasma is viable. It's safe. And right now, it's the only chance half these people have. Another explosion, closer this time. The lights flickered. Somewhere in the hospital, someone was screaming. Thornberry looked at Margaret, then at the chaos around them, then back at Margaret. She could see the war happen behind his eyes. Professional caution versus desperate necessity. Protocol versus survival. If I authorize this, he said slowly, and someone dies from transfusion reaction, then it's on me, Margaret said firmly. I'll take full responsibility. No, Thornberry said. If I authorize it, it's on me. I'm the senior physician here. He took a deep breath. Dr. Chun, Sister Hartley, retrieve the preserved plasma from the laboratory. We'll start with the most critical cases. At the first sign of adverse reaction, we stop immediately. Understood? Margaret didn't wait for further discussion. She ran to the laboratory. Dr. Winters already there, having anticipated the need. How many can we prepare? She asked. We have 30 samples ready. I can have 50 more within the hour if we work fast. They worked. Margaret had never moved faster, never been more focused. Each sample was tested one final time. Each solution was measured precisely. Each container was labeled meticulously. This had to be perfect. Lives depended on it. Back in the emergency ward, Margaret set up the first transfusion. The young woman in base 7, now unconscious, her pulse barely perceptible. Starting infusion, Margaret announced, her hand steady despite her racing heart. She'd done this once before with Jimmy Pemberton, but that had been one patient, one chance, one gamble. This was different. This was a dozen people, then another dozen, all depending on her method working not once but repeatedly, consistently. The young woman's vital signs stabilized within minutes. Her color improved. Her pulse strengthened. It's working, the assisting nurse breathed. Bay after bay, patient after patient. Margaret moved through the ward like a woman possessed, setting up transfusions, monitoring reactions, adjusting flow rates. Dr. Chun and Dr. Winters helped, each taking patients of their own. Not everyone survived. Some injuries were too severe, too much damage done before they'd arrived at the hospital. But of the patients who received the preserved plasma, not one showed signs of transfusion reaction. Not one died from the treatment itself. As dawn broke over London, the air raid sirens finally fell silent. Margaret stood in the ward, surrounded by patients who had survived the night. 18 transfusions using her preserved plasma. 18 people who would have died without it. Dr. Thornberry found her there, his face gray with exhaustion, but his eyes sharp. No adverse reactions? He asked. None, sir. He nodded slowly, and for the first time since Margaret had known him, she saw something like respect in his expression. Sister Hartley, he said quietly, so only she could hear, I owe you an apology. I called your work foolish. I was wrong. What you've accomplished here, it's remarkable, and I should have seen it sooner. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. There was no time for emotion yet. Thank you, sir, but we can't stop here. If this method can save lives in London, think what it could do on the front lines. In North Africa, in Italy, anywhere our soldiers are fighting and bleeding and dying for this one thing we can give them. Thornberry was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You're right. Come to my office this afternoon. We need to contact the War Office. Your method needs to reach the field hospitals as quickly as possible. As he walked away, Dr. Chen appeared at Margaret's elbow. You did it, Dr. Chen said simply. We did it, Margaret corrected. None of this would have been possible without you. But Margaret knew the real work was just beginning. Proving the method worked was one thing. Implementing it across military field hospitals scattered across multiple continents was something else entirely, and the War Office, she suspected, would prove just as skeptical as Dr. Thornberry had been. She looked out the window at the smoke still rising over London. Somewhere out there in North Africa or Italy or France, soldiers were dying on operating tables for want of blood. She'd save lives tonight, but there were hundreds more to save, and Margaret Hartley intended to save every one of them she could. The legacy? 3 months later, Margaret stood in a military transport vehicle as it rumbled to the Tunisian desert. The heat was oppressive, the dust everywhere, coat in her clothes, getting into her hair, grit shing between her teeth, but she barely noticed. Her attention was fixed on the precious cargo. 20 crates of preserved plasma, each bottle carefully packed, each one representing hours of work back in London. The journey from Dr. Thornberry's office to this moment had been anything but straightforward. The War Office had been predictably skeptical. A nurse with an untested preservation method? Preposterous. But Thornberry had proven to be an unexpectedly fierce advocate. He'd pulled strings, called in favors, leveraged his reputation as one of Britain's most respected surgeons. If this method can do in the field what it did during the Blitz, he told the Military Medical Board, we could reduce casualty mortality rates by 20% or more. Can you afford to ignore that? They couldn't. Field trials had been authorized, and Margaret, to her amazement, had been assigned to personally oversee the initial implementation in North Africa, where the British Eighth Army was engaged in brutal combat against Rommel's Afrika Korps. The field hospital appeared as a collection of tents in the desert, marked by red crosses that seemed pitifully small against a vast expanse of sand and sky. As the transport pulled to a stop, a man emerged from the largest tent, tall, sun-weathered, with the bearing of someone who'd seen far too much death. "Sister Hartley, I presume?" he called out in a thick Scottish accent. "Major Douglas Mackenzie, Chief Medical Officer. Welcome to paradise." Margaret climbed down from the transport, her legs stiff from the long journey. "Major, thank you for agreeing to this trial." Mackenzie's smile was wry. "Agreeing is a strong word. The War Office suggested very strongly that I cooperate. But between you and me, sister, I'm desperate enough to try anything. We lose more boys to hemorrhagic shock than to the Germans. If your miracle plasma can help, I'll be the first to sing praises." He helped her team unload the crates, handling each one with surprising gentleness. "How does it work, then?" Margaret explained as they worked, detailing the preservation method, the storage requirements, the administration protocols. Mackenzie listened intently, asking sharp questions that showed he understood the implications. "Room temperature stable for 48 hours?" he said, impressed. "That's the holy grail, sister. Refrigeration out here is a luxury we rarely have. And even when we do, one German air raid, and our blood supplies cook in the heat." "That's exactly what I'd hoped to solve," Margaret said. That evening, she was given a tent to herself, another luxury, she was told. As she unpacked her meager belongings, a young corporal appeared at the tent flap. "Begging your pardon, sister, but Major Mackenzie requests you in the surgical tent. Casualties coming in from the front." The surgical tent was chaos. 3 operating tables, all occupied, with surgeons working frantically by lamplight. The smell of blood and antiseptic was overwhelming. "Sister Hartley," Mackenzie called from the nearest table. "This lad needs blood now. We're out of whole blood. Time to see if your magic works." The soldier on the table couldn't have been more than 19, his face pale as death, his abdomen torn open by shrapnel. Margaret could see the desperation in Mackenzie's eyes. Without transfusion, this boy would die in minutes. Her hands didn't shake as she prepared the plasma. She'd done this dozens of times now, but it never got easier. Each time felt like the first time with Jimmy Pemberton. The weight of a life in her hands, the knowledge that she could save or destroy with equal ease. "Starting infusion," she announced. Mackenzie continued his surgery, his hands moving with practiced efficiency even as he watched the plasma drip into the soldier's vein. Time seemed to slow. Margaret monitored the boy's vital signs, watching for any sign of reaction. His blood pressure stabilized. His color began to improve. His pulse strengthened. "Well, I'll be damned," Mackenzie breathed. "It's working. It's actually working." Over the next week, Margaret worked alongside Mackenzie and his team, implementing the plasma preservation system throughout the field hospital. She trained the medical staff on preparation techniques, storage protocols, and administration procedures. She documented every transfusion, every outcome, building the evidence base that would be needed to expand the program. The results spoke for themselves. Mortality rates from hemorrhagic shock dropped by nearly 30%. Soldiers who would have died on the operating table survived. Word spread quickly through the military medical network. On her 8th day at the field hospital, Margaret received a telegram from London. It was from Dr. Thornberry. War Office approved full implementation. Stop your method now. Official protocol. Stop production scaling for all theaters. Stop. Well done, Hartley. Stop. Margaret read it 3 times, hardly believing it. Her method, born from desperation in a London hospital during the Blitz, was now official military protocol. It would be used across Europe, Africa, Asia, anywhere British soldiers were fighting. Good news? Mackenzie asked, reading her expression. "The best," Margaret said, showing the telegraph. Mackenzie grinned. "Sister Hartley, you've just saved more lives than most generals. I'd say that deserves a celebration, but we're fresh out of champagne. How about terrible coffee instead?" They sat outside the medical tent as the sun set over the desert, drinking coffee that was indeed terrible, watching the smoke from distant artillery fire stain the horizon. "What you've done here," Mackenzie said thoughtfully, "it's more than just a preservation method. You've given us hope. Every medical officer out here feels helpless sometimes, watching boys die for want of something as simple as blood. You've given us a way to fight back." "I just want to help," Margaret said simply. "That's what they all say," Mackenzie replied. "The ones who actually change things. They never do it for glory or recognition. They do it because they see a problem and can't rest until they've solved it." 6 months later, Margaret was back in London, back at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, but everything had changed. Her preservation method had been refined, scaled, and distributed to field hospitals across every theater of war. Thousands of soldiers had received transfusions using preserved plasma. Thousands of lives had been saved. The newspapers had gotten hold of the story. Naturally, the nurse who revolutionized blood medicine. One headline proclaimed, "British innovation saves thousands," declared another. Margaret hated the attention, but Dr. Thornberry had insisted she accept it gracefully. "You've earned this recognition," he'd told her. "And more importantly, it highlights the importance of thinking beyond traditional boundaries, of listening to ideas no matter who they come from." The hospital had established a proper blood preservation research unit. With Margaret as its director, she had a team now, proper laboratory space, official sanction for her work. It was everything she'd never dared to dream of. But on this particular evening, as Margaret walked through the hospital wards, she wasn't thinking about headlines or research units. She was thinking about Jimmy Pemberton, the boy who'd been her first success, who'd survived because she'd been willing to break the rules. She found him in a visitor's lounge, now 17 and recovered from his accident, talking animatedly with his father. When he saw Margaret, his face lit up. "Sister Hartley, Dad was just telling me about the newspaper article. They're calling you a hero." Margaret smiled. "I'm no hero, Jimmy. Just a nurse who got lucky." "Lucky?" Thomas Pemberton spoke up. "Sister Hartley, you saved my boy's life when everyone else had given up. You've saved thousands more since then. That's not luck. That's courage and brilliance." Margaret felt her cheeks warm. "I had help. Dr. Chun, Dr. Thornberry, Dr. Winters, Major Mackenzie. None of this would have been possible without them. But you were the one who started it," Jimmy said. "You were the one who saw the problem and refused to accept that people had to die. That's what makes you a hero." As Margaret left the hospital that evening, walking through streets that were slowly recovering from the Blitz, she reflected on the journey from that desperate night when she'd first decided to experiment to this moment, when her method was saving lives across the globe. She thought about all the people who'd mocked her foolish ideas, who'd called her naive and presumptuous. She thought about how close she'd come to giving up, to accepting that nurses had their place and shouldn't overstep. But most of all, she thought about the soldiers on operating tables in Tunisia and Italy and France, receiving plasma that would keep them alive. She thought about the nurses and doctors who now had one more tool in their fight against death. She thought about every life saved, every family spared the grief of loss. That was her legacy, not the headlines or the recognition, but the knowledge that she'd seen a problem and solved it, that she refused to accept unnecessary death as inevitable. As she turned the corner toward her flat, Margaret Hartley smiled. Tomorrow, there will be more work to do, more problems to solve, more lives to save. The war wasn't over, and neither was her mission. But tonight, for just this moment, she allowed herself to feel proud. She'd been mocked for her foolish ideas, but those ideas had saved hundreds on the front line. And that, she thought, was more than enough.